Welcome back. Today's podcast is a result of a lot of folks asking for help how to do a CMA, which frankly should be something all of us learn when we get our real estate licenses, but I know that is not the case. And a lot of folks have been spoiled by a market where frankly pricing real estate has been super easy and a proliferation of a lot of done-for-you CMA widgets and apps and all the rest of it. But I'm here to tell you that there's an art to pricing properties correctly, and it gives you an unfair advantage in the marketplace, especially when dealing with a very analytical seller. So today's podcast is The Art of Property Pricing, Simple Steps to CMA Success.
Yes, that's right. And we're going to look at it from mostly the listing end of things, because that's when you have to do a comparable market analysis. But also everything that we talk about from the listing standpoint applies to you on the buyer side when preparing and coaching your buyer side clients. What really should they offer in terms of price?
You know what, Julie, that is such a good point, because again, agents have never learned how to do proper CMAs, and in a marketplace where agents are going to have to start proving their value to prospective buyers, like sellers or listing agents have had to do forever, knowing how to do a CMA is equally as important as it is when listing or competing for a listing as it is when competing for a buyer.
That's exactly right. Pricing is one of the most important skills that you need to be a successful and effective real estate professional. With more inventory and fewer motivated buyers in the market, mispricing a home can cause your listing to expire, cause you to be fired, or make your buyer miss out by offering the wrong price, either up or down. Whether you're pricing a listing or advising a buyer what to offer in their dream home, it's time to sharpen those skills. Now, first note I made here as I was deciding, how to handle this podcast outline, the first note was don't assume that everything in your market has the same pricing trends. Pricing is a case-by-case analysis and strategy. It would be easy to believe that, as long as I know my stats in Columbus, I know the average list to sell price ratio, the days on the market, that it would be easy if I could apply that to every neighborhood, and yet that's not true.
Well, that's the problem with these apps, frankly. That's the problem with, frankly, the Zillow Z-Estimate widget that they don't even really market anymore. The problem is that streets, neighborhoods, communities have their own little finite details, and if you're not aware of them, you're going to get it improperly priced. But here, going back to the competitive advantage of knowing how to do a good CMA, when you are aware of them and you are explaining the differences, the little nuanced differences to a prospective buyer or seller, that will get you the business. 9 times out of 10, the other agents aren't going to have that skill set. And I remind you that the notes for today's podcast are available exclusively to our free subscribers to our newsletter, which is harrisrealestatedaily.com. harrisrealestatedaily.com is the place where all of our newsletter notes now live, and where you can also listen to exclusive interviews that we're starting to release. We released our first one last Friday. We're going to start releasing 2 to 3 of these interviews per week. So Harris Real Estate Daily subscribers, you get access to that content first. The newsletter is free. It takes 2 seconds to sign up. Just go to harrisrealestatedaily.com, or you can scroll down below and click in the show's description, whether you're on YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you're at. You can scroll down below and join harrisrealestatedaily.com. So Julie, let's get to part 1.
Yes. All right. So again, keeping in mind that you're not going to universally apply all rules to all properties, you will take it on a case-by-case scenario. So that brings us to part 1, which is simply knowing your subject property. If you're winging it about that, you're not going to have an accurate CMA. So what should your search parameters actually be? Start broad and then narrow in depending on how many comparable homes you find. So for example, let's say your subject property is a typical 3-bedroom, 2.5-bath, 2-car garage house that's about 2,500 square feet and 15 years old. It's in average condition on a good street in a desirable neighborhood, kind of standard issue, right? So how would you handle something like this? I've got it broken down into the geographic search, the schools, the age, the condition, the size, cost per square foot, and style. We're going to talk about that first. And then once we've sorted out what you should use as criteria, then we'll talk about what to do with those facts.
And good. This is great. This would be great content. These very notes that Julie's reading you would be great to present to a seller. Explain to them what goes into a CMA. I mean, that is a great idea.
Sure. You could certainly take the notes from the newsletter. You could turn them into your own proprietary list and talk to the seller about the fact that you don't just throw a dart at the wall. These are the things that actually go into pricing your home.
And prove to the seller and to the buyer that, like you said, it's not just simply going to an app and seeing what the app spits out as far as what the property's worth.
Mm-hmm. That's right. So geographic search. If your subject home is a, quote, normal residential neighborhood property, keep your comps in that same neighborhood or competing neighborhoods, depending on how big the neighborhood is in the situation. Now, if the subject property is rural or semi-rural, stick to the county or at least within a 20-mile radius if possible. If it's a farm, mixed use, or something unusual to you, get help from your broker and or an appraiser. All of you should be friends with 2 or 3 appraisers, if for no other reason than to just run it up the flagpole, ask them some questions, and get to know how they look at some of those properties.
And the next point is really important because, frankly, you could have 2 or 3 rural-ish, communities, zip codes, all backing up to each other, but one of them happens to have really, or their schools are excellent.
That's right. All right. And the next one might barely even have any schools, right?
Right.
Okay. So let's talk about schools. If you're in an area where schools matter, stick with the same school district. If you can't find enough comparable sales, consider competing school districts. So that means you need to know something about your school districts if you are selling in an area where it matters.
Now, Julie and I, when we sold real estate, we initially sold real estate for like the first 3 or 4 years. We were prominent in an area called Clintonville, 43214. And then in that particular area, the public schools were just but the private schools there, which were mostly Catholic schools, were great. And so people would move there and they'd send their kids to the Catholic schools, and the Catholic schools really weren't that expensive, and the property tax in this particular area was less than the next zip code, which was 43085, where the schools were better, but still, it wasn't the same as Clintonville. So just keep all these things in mind. These are the little nuanced differences. And with regards to school ratings and all that, it is very easy to meander into thin ice and starting to have people accuse you of maybe what were the laws pertaining to all the
steering and things like that.
All that stuff. So there are lots of actual, school recommendation websites
with statistics, not opinion. That's what you want to stick to keep yourself. Yeah.
So have that at the ready when you're presenting that to prospective buyers or sellers, because you, for example, could be talking with a seller that's not that maybe when they moved to a community, the schools in that particular community were great. It's often the case, but then they fell behind to the neighboring school systems and other zip codes, and they don't realize that their school system isn't desirable anymore. They're out of touch. You're going to actually have to show them that information as to why their house is actually not worth the same as, maybe it's the exact same make and model at, same builder and same model house that's 5 miles away in a different zip code with different schools. You're going to have to know all this stuff to, if nothing else, to prove to the seller and prove to the prospective buyers that you're not just, sticking it in some app and waiting for the results to spit out. You're an actual expert.
That's right. And I think it's valuable for you to know that just for your own real estate brain, because you're going to use this in many ways. Maybe somebody's moving across town. Maybe they're a first-time buyer and they have little kids. They're not sure how to pick a school district. And certainly, I remember working with lots of relocation executives, and they weren't sure, should I choose between New Albany, Worthington? How do I decide? So you should have some resources that are fact-based, stat-based, that you can direct them to, where it literally will it'll compare like how many, the student to teacher ratio, and how many kids are in the school and all that stuff. That's not for you to say, that's for you to recommend. Okay, what about the age of the house? Stick to similarly aged homes, give or take 10 years or so on each side. If you don't find enough comps, you can expand more years out and mess with the age. All MLSs have a year built search widget.
That's super tricky, though, I have to say.
Yes.
I mean, the age thing is super tricky, because if you're living in an area where, and all of you are, what I'm about to describe, with the exception of those of you in rural areas, you're all going to be dealing with this. Probably the most desirable places to live in your particular, overall MLS area are the ones that are the most densely populated, where the houses are landlocked. In other words, they can't build more houses unless something else is torn down, or, you guys get the idea. Those houses are, generally speaking, going to have maybe what one would consider obsolete floor plans. An obsolete floor plan might be a split level. It's just an opinion-based thing, but appraisers do take that into consideration. Or maybe the house is older, or maybe the house, there's features that are not as desirable because the house is 30 or 40 years older than, say, for example, a new house. Housing styles, all that stuff is trendy. So just keep all this in mind, that when you're working on, doing a CMA, and you're, say, working in an area that you're not that familiar with, don't let your biases towards older homes have an effect, because the older homes that are closer into the amenities, closer into the cities, those older homes are going to sell for a lot more than ones that are further out. Look at, for example, Austin, Texas.
Yes, like Terrytown and some of those places.
Exactly. You drive through Austin, Texas, and the houses there that are worth, upwards to $1 million. To Julie and I, Central Ohio trained brains, those houses look like they should be maybe like 150, honestly.
That's true.
And then for if you're willing to travel 30 to 40 minutes outside of Austin, You can buy something for $1 million. It looks like, I mean, it's, you know, a big house with maybe an acre or two. So again, these things you should already know, but you're going to have to take all of what your knowledge base is and go to the next level. If you want to know who the agents are, or who the agents who are going to be ruling the market soon, they're the ones that are skills based. All the marketing, the branding agents, if they have the skills, they're going to do great too. But for the most part, that's not what you find. You find skills-based agents that are starting to dominate the market. Julie, your coaching clients are like this too.
Yes, they absolutely are. And it is something that we talk about on coaching calls, is being careful with pricing, because it is, as you said at the top of this podcast, a competitive advantage to be good at this and to show your skills and to show how careful you are. Sellers oftentimes will value that greatly, and they'll actually end up pricing it more competitively than they would have on their own because you showed them your expertise.
So Julie and I would go on more expensive listing appointments, and frankly, some listing appointments weren't more expensive, but they were past clients of ours. So we go on them together, and Julie and I would split the listing appointment. Our listing presentation was what we teach you guys in Premier Coaching, but Julie's little carve out was the CMA. And I have to tell you, there were times where, we called it the cat and monkey show, basically.
Our nickname for it.
I'm not sure which one was the cat, which was the monkey.
I didn't say that on the title.
Yeah, I guess in retrospect, maybe I was the monkey. I was the performing monkey. Anyway, so I would get the energy and the motivation and all this, the rhythm going. And then they would be emotionally locked into us. They understood our USPs. They maybe were saying they wanted to list with us. But then the CMA presentation was around the corner. Now, we did give them our CMAs prior to going on the listing appointment in the pre-listing pack, which we suggest you do as well, but we wouldn't nail down the price. We'd give them all the comps, we'd give them all the information, but we'd give them three different three different pricing options depending on, frankly, what we thought of the house when we got there. So when we got to the CMA portion, I would say 50% of the time, we would take the listing because Julie was presenting the CMA at a very high level, especially in the second part of our career. We're presenting to a lot of CFOs and CEOs and doctors and such, because our average sale price went up by 5 or 6x. We moved to a different part of Columbus. So when we did that and we started presenting this sort of analytical information at a very high level, we didn't realize it at first, but they eventually started telling us, why haven't the other agents told us all the things that you're telling us about, the nuanced differences. Like in New Albany, where we were selling, a brick home was worth more than a wood-sided home, okay? But a white painted brick home was worth more than a red brick painted home. And then there was a federal style home versus a colonial versus a Georgian style home. I mean, all these little things. But we did notice it in the comps, and Julie could actually point out that a federal home that was painted white was going to be worth this much more than us. It's nuts, but all those little things, I remember to this day, we would have maybe, the cross-armed sellers who were could give us, whatever, maybe we'll list you guys, maybe we won't. And then as soon as Julie started to nerd out on the CMA, they just loved the fact that she'd spent so much time on it and had so much detail. And we take the listing, and they would tell us later, it wasn't because of your guys' great presentation or your, amazing marketing or all the wonderful things you're offering, as far as your pre-listing pack. It was because you guys really spent the time to get to know my house. They would say that to us.
Or they would just say you were more professional, and that relates to providing them with a professional price analysis, right? So thank you for that. And we could go on with many, many stories. I remember those white painted houses because we would have clients, if they did buy those, I remember they were talking about how expensive it was. That we had one client that would paint one side of the house per year and just constantly revolve because it was so expensive. These are big houses.
Well, they had to do it that way because the
faded.
Right, exactly, the fading, and also because on the west side of the house, the sun would actually run the paint dry faster than on the other side. That's actually the reason they did, not because of pricing.
Well, anyway. Okay, so condition. Speaking of paint and things like that. Condition. This includes curb appeal and age of not just the home, but the appliances, the roof, the decking, other items that could be looking worn. Has the house been rehabbed? And I also learned in our pre-qualification script, if they say it's been rehabbed, when? How long ago? Because sometimes that was 1968 and they remember it because it was a big rehab. So if so, how recently? Also ask lots of questions using your seller's pre-qualification script. You get that as part of your coaching. But keep in mind that condition can be everything from curb appeal to even the neighborhood condition, the appliances, and the age of the house.
Well, these are important things to know before you go on the appointment with the seller. But remember, when you're a coaching client, one of the things we're going to teach you how to use is our pre-listing pack. In the pre-listing pack, it's all the reasons why the seller is going to want to list with you. It's like your silent salesperson. If you don't pre-qualify the seller and you don't send a pre-listing pack ahead of time, you're probably going to maybe, even if you know that seller and their center of influence type, the super, the easier listings to take, you're probably 50-50 as to whether or not you're going to take it. Why? Because the seller doesn't want to have any unanswered questions by the time you get there. The seller doesn't want the tension in the house. Your listing appointment should be 15 to 20 minutes max. And so this is what we're doing is we're drilling down on the whole importance of the CMA. Like I just said, we want you to include the CMA and three potential outcomes of the house selling at low, medium, and high in the CMA, and also 3 potential net sheets. Why? Because when you get there, the seller will have already reviewed all of that crap. They're going to know what your commission is. They're going to know what your processing fee is. They're going to know what your everything is. And we also want you to include the listing contract. I know you use DocuSign and all the rest of it, but we want you to include a physical listing contract so that they can read it prior to you getting there. You guys get it? And this is, again, the importance of knowing how to operate in a market that demands you to be more professional and be skills-based. That's the reason thousands of agents are joining Premier Coaching every year. And Premier Coaching is our gateway into coaching. It's not our highest level coaching product. It's not one-on-one coaching, but it is group coaching. It is semi-private coaching, and you get a semi-private coaching call every day. In addition to that, you get all the things we talk about every day on the podcast, the scripts, the objection handlers, the presentations. You can join Premier Coaching for free. Just go to premiercoaching.com, premiercoaching.com, or you can scroll down and click the link below. And again, the 30-day free trial does include daily semi-private coaching calls. So don't wait on that. Get on that right away.
All right, so back to this is all part one, which is knowing the parameters you should be using to do your searches for your comps. All right, so size. Don't make your size parameters too strict to start. If it's a 2,500 square foot home, search from 1,900 to 3,100 feet to see what comps appear. And then you can narrow it closer to 2,500 if you've got a lot of comps. If you have hardly anything, then you might have to even expand it more and then make some adjustments.
Can I throw in some stuff on that?
Well, we're going to talk, I think where you're going is cost per square foot.
Yeah, you're right.
Yes, I read your mind. That's okay, because we've done this millions of times. All right, so cost per square foot. Now, this can be a big black hole of mispricing if you don't look at it correctly. This is only one way to price property and should never be your only parameter. And I think you've known a lot of agents too, where that's virtually the only thing they do. They just do a little cost per square foot analysis and they say, well, you've got this many square feet times this much per square foot, and your house is worth X. You might be right, but it should never be the only parameter. Consider the fact that the smaller the home, the higher the cost per square foot typically is. The cost per square foot is also different on new construction than it is on resale. So again, it is one way to help you design your price strategy, but it should just be one of the criteria.
All right, so here's where it gets wacky. On cost per square foot, I'll give you guys some cheat codes. Now, if you're going to do a cost per square foot, and you cannot include the basement and a bedroom in the basement unless there's a full egress window. So any of you have been in real estate for more than a heartbeat know what I'm talking about. In other words, if you want to know the best way to get a return on investment, if you want to fix your house up, you want to make a lot of money on it, finish the basement, dig out full-size windows, and then legally in an appraisal or a CMA, for the sake of this podcast, you can actually count that as finished square footage.
As long as it has a closet and you don't have to walk through another bedroom to get to it.
That's right. So that is the easy button for actually increasing the property value substantially. And finishing a basement is not expensive comparatively because the walls, the floors are already there, but you do have to do the rest of the work. Now, if someone's already done the rest of the work, but they did not dig out the windows and they're just normal basement style windows and they're not full egress windows, you legally cannot, or at least an appraiser will not count that as cost per square foot. All right, want it to be even more interesting. And where we live in Puerto Rico and a lot of places in the South, Florida, for example, they count, wait for it, they count square footage as anything under a roof, okay? That's including your garage. That's including your patios.
Whether it's air conditioned or not.
Exactly. Yeah. So I'll give you our villa as an example. Our villa is something like 1,600 square feet. Wow, that's a huge villa. Well, guess what? If you take away the garage and you take away the covered, patios and the rest of it, it's more like 3,800 square feet. So that's just, for example. So make sure when you're using cost per square foot, like here in Puerto Rico, you can't really even use it because sometimes they're going to do the old style cost per square foot that includes everything that's covered. Other times they're going to do, air conditioned square footage is another way they call it. So if you're just using a dippity-doo CMA program, it's going to give you a price that's way off what the actual market value is. and you're not going to be an expert, and you're not going to have earned that buyer or that seller's business.
Well, that highlights your value. Isn't that something that's a hot topic right now, is articulating your value to both the buyer side and the seller side? These are things, to your point, that an app is not going to take into consideration.
And if you're doing new construction and it's possible, that's the cheapest time to actually do a walkout basement with the full egress windows. And any builder can do it. It's not a big deal. But yeah, I mean, there's something, if you're working with a buyer and you're trying to show ultimate value to your buyer, and you find a house that's on a slight hill, or, where it's possible to dig out a window and 3 windows maybe and a door, well, you're just doing that buyer an enormous favor. Can you imagine when, I bet you the new build rep won't even know what I just told you. So when you tell that buyer, like, guess what? This is going to make it so that you guys can finish this off for probably, I don't know, $30 to $50 a square foot to finish a basement. Maybe it's a little bit more, you're going to make it fancy. But when it comes to appraisal, you're going to be worth this much more when the neighborhood's done. And there's other comps.
That's right. Built-in equity, right? Okay, so just a couple more points, and then we're going to talk about your actual comparables. The style. Is your subject property typical of the area, or is it unusual? If it's the only modern home in a sea of colonials, it might actually be harder to sell. You should have some comps that show that or not. Alternatively, if your property is the quintessential example of, say, an East Coast Cape Cod, and it's actually in Cape Cod, it might fetch a premium price with multiple offers. Adjust accordingly. That can be the kiss of death. If you're the unusual house and nobody understands the floor plan and it looks different from the street, and now it's got a side door instead of a front door, the style can actually erode the price. Okay, now, once you have all these search parameters sorted out, as we've discussed, now you're going to keep those search criteria consistent for finding comps in 3 categories: sold comparables, active competition, and pending homes. You're trying to make your subject property make sense amongst all of those things. And Tim, you mentioned something as you were reviewing this. You also should take a look at what's expired and try and suss out why something like that, if it looks like a basic comparable to your subject property, but it expired after, say, 90 days on the market. Well, what might have caused that? Maybe go through the pictures, maybe call the listing agent. Maybe they just had something else, like it was hard to show, but you need to figure that out as well.
Well, also, this is the other thing. You can go into, look to see how many price reductions there have been in a particular market.
That's coming up.
Okay.
Good foreshadowing. Okay. So remember, we're looking at 3 categories: active, sold, and pending. Active is what listing agents and sellers are trying to get. So how does your subject property stack up to that? Pending homes are the ones that have at least been able to go pending, and sold comps are the proof in the pricing. Use all 3 to price your subject property.
Let me interject something here. So I had
Sure.
a call. It was, I don't know, maybe last year. And it was with a gal in Florida that wanted to join with you and I at eXp Realty. Mm-hmm. And she had been dominant in this particular community of selling condos that were beachfront. I don't remember where in Florida. Actually, I do. It was on the Gulf side. All right, so this particular community, some hurricane had essentially eviscerated all the condos that were fronting the water. But the second row, which means the ones that aren't on the water, but right behind the ones that are on the water, were fine. Mm-hmm. But what happened is not only were the ones on the water eviscerated, but also those folks were having almost an impossible time. The condo associations couldn't get reinsured.
That's right.
So you got to know all these little nuanced differences. Like, why is it if all of a sudden, the property's facing the water, because that maybe had been the 3rd hurricane in 10 years and no one was going to insure it. Okay, maybe all those condos now are going to be almost unsellable because nobody can get a homeowner's insurance, which is going to, or, the associations can't get insurance, but the ones on the second row are actually still insurable. So now all of a sudden you have where the properties that aren't facing the water started to become more valuable than the ones that were facing the water. So you've got to know all these little things. In her particular market, a lot of those owners were absentee. And so she was having to explain all this to folks that maybe had owned these condos for generations as to why your beachfront property is now worth less than the one that's actually behind it. You could have bought 30 years ago for half the price.
Well, that's where your local expertise really pays off. And AI is not going to know that. Nope. And your apps aren't going to know that. Your automated CMAs won't know that. Okay. Part 2 is wrapping all of this up. And then we're going to get into part 3, which only has a few points here. So part 2, gather your comparables. Now that we know your subject property and what you're going to use, your criteria, search active, sold, and pending sales using these consistent search parameters: average sold, pending, or active price, depending on the category; the list to sell price ratio, that's the difference between the final list price and the actual sold price; the average days on the market; the number of price reductions typical to go pending or sold, the number of competing homes if you were to list today, that's looking at your active competition, and are incentives offered by resale listings and or new construction. That's an important category not to overlook. So then you're going to preview the active and pending sales and call the listing agents of sold comparables to polish your price. This includes touring new construction if your subject property competes with new construction. And note to self, and I used to love this when this happened because it was so predictable. When you're at the listing presentation, let the sellers know that you took the time to preview all of their competition and pending sales. Did anyone else do this for them? Not likely. I think I virtually never heard that anybody else did that. This is a competitive advantage. Now, if you know your inventory really well, maybe you're a very experienced agent, you might not have to physically preview. You can look at the pictures in the MLS and pretty much know what you're doing. But especially if you are newer or uncomfortable with pricing, especially when you know you're competing, you have to do the preview.
So 2 thoughts. Number 1, when you're pre-qualifying, I'm kind of taking you guys back in the process. You've set the listing appointment. Now you're going to pre-qualify the seller. One of the questions in our pre-qualifying script is basically you're wanting to find out what the seller thinks the property is worth. There's actually 3 questions that are one after the other that's trying to drill down on what their opinion of price is. Now I'm here to tell you there's never been a seller on the face of planet Earth that doesn't have an opinion of what their price of their home is. And a lot of times, especially if they're in a more of a predictable cookie cutter type neighborhood, they're probably going to be pretty damn accurate. So ask the seller, and you can ask the seller what you think the price is by just being direct, but they're going to mostly throw it back at you and say something snide like, well, that's your job. That's the reason I'm having you out, which is putting you on your heels. So a clever way of doing it is, so Mr. Seller, listen, I'm going to be spending maybe 2 or 3 hours working on a CMA, which is basically a real estate agent's version of an appraisal. And a part of it is me choosing the right comps so that I can use those as when putting suggested pricing on your property. Now, I have my own opinions, but I would also like your opinion on the properties that you've seen sell in your marketplace. Maybe you saw them in person, or maybe you saw them virtually, or you have knowledge of them. What properties have you seen sell that you thought were similar to your house? Maybe same age, maybe same street, same size of the lot, those types of things. And then just shut up and let them answer. Because what you're going to hear is they're going to tell you what they think the house is worth. They're going to say, well, there's this house and I went to a Christmas party here, and these people had an open house, and they're never really necessarily going to say the neighbor's house was nicer, but at least you have a sense of what they think their comps should be. So you got to ask that question, because then you know where their mind's at as far as pricing. Now I'm going to give you a little advanced coaching. If you ask that question and they're cagey with the answer, I'm going to tell you why. It's because they think their house is worth more than what it should reasonably be worth, and they want to see what you're going to say. In other words, maybe they think, well, I don't want to tell you my price because I don't want you just to use my price to try to get the listing. But most likely what's going on is maybe the house is worth $1 million, right? There's no reason to believe it's not worth $1 million plus or minus 50 grand. But this seller has it in their mind that it's worth $1,250,000 because of whatever reason. And if they're not going to tell you what they think comps are for their price on their house, it's because they know there are no comps at the price that they think their house is worth. So just remember I told you that. In that case, go on the listing appointment anyway, but at least you know what you're dealing with.
Yeah, that's almost always true, right?
Well, I'll tell you where you go with that if you want to know the truth. Is go back to what their motivation is. And you don't waste time when you're pre-qualifying them. Don't try to sell them anything. You're just getting information. So as Mr. Seller, when this property sells, where are you guys going to go next? Well, we're going to move to California, and let's say they're in Massachusetts. Oh, California! Wow, that's exciting. Ideally, how soon do you need to be there? Well, we need to be there within the next 6 months. Next 6 months? Wow, okay. Well, that probably gives us enough time. So, and then just move on, because now you have their motivation. Now you have a time frame, and even if they're a little lofty on their price, you can still work around that with our coaching and still take the listing and get it sold for them.
Well, there is an art to all of this, isn't there? So here's the thing. Once you've done all of this research and you've got your comps together, you have average numbers on each of those categories. You should have a pretty good feel for price, or at least a pretty tight price range. Now, why the range? For 2 reasons. One is, if you have not physically seen the house and you walk in for your listing presentation and something surprises you, either good or bad, you've built in a little bit of wiggle room. Second reason is it may depend a little bit on the seller's situation. Maybe they're going to finish new build construction. They've got a little bit more time versus finding out that, oh my gosh, they found out they're getting relocated a lot sooner than they said on your call. So you've got a little bit of a slide, but don't make your range outrageous. It shouldn't be 500 to a million. It should be maybe, 925 to a million.
Right. So in other words, the seller's not feeling that much pressure, to Julie's example about new construction being completed. So they're going to maybe choose to voluntarily overprice it, thinking that maybe, they can just reduce the price over time. And you're going to have to explain to them how that's sometimes actually the worst thing to do because the inventory becomes stale. We teach you how to do that in Premier Coaching. Again, guys, hopefully you're learning. This is no longer a look at me market. This is a skills-based market. Develop these skills and you'll dominate your market. Julie.
That's right. So that's about creating a price, at least a price range. Now, part 3 is all about strategy. Number 1, remember the NAR script. If after 2 weeks or 10 showings, we don't have a workable offer, we need to consider adjusting the price to more accurately reflect the buyer's expectations.
And in the pre-listing pack, there's actually a graph, listing presentations, there's a graph that shows that shows, and by the way, this graph's been around since like the 1970s.
It's all still true.
Yeah, it is true. So I remember the center of it, like if you get 2 weeks or 10 showings with no offers, you're 10% overpriced. If it's 5 weeks just all these different variables.
I remember exactly what that is. So there's 2 parts to that, and that's the part that nobody remembers. They remember this part, 2 weeks or 10 showings. But what it actually says is if you are having a lot of showings but no offers, you're only a tad overpriced. You just need a little bit of adjustment to whatever's the next comp below you. If you're getting slow, no showings or crickets, and it looks like nobody cares that you're on the market, you are probably in the 10 to 15% overpriced range for whatever reason, whether that was the seller or the agent.
And the other comps you're selling too.
Yes, exactly.
Your houses you're competing against are selling.
That's right. So you have to, knowing the NAR script, that's kind of your backup plan that you talk about with the seller. Now, number 2, consider a pre-inspection to address any potential issues that could wreck the deal later. More about pricing strategy, and that's especially true in older homes, maybe not so much if it's a 3 or 4 year old kind of new construction.
Let's give them some advanced coaching on this, okay? So when you're walking around, on the listing appointment, we want you walking around with the seller. I know some people say don't go on a tour of the house. That's so stupid. Anybody that tells you that has never actually sold real estate before, because the seller thinks you're there to get to know the property. How the hell are you going to know the property if you don't actually see it prior to actually putting a price on it? Yeah. Anyway. So you're going to walk around with the seller, and we have a lot of scripts and techniques when walking around. But you're going to see things that you know from your experience, or at least, you maybe watch enough home improvement shows. You got Bob Vila on the mind, and you're going to see, hey, guess what? That basement wall is bowed, yes. Or that hot water tank has got the signature of Nixon on it. I mean, old things and strange things and leaky things and smelly things, and the floor's not straight. I mean, even on new homes, you're going to see some of this. Or you're going to go into a house and maybe you're going to stick your head up in the attic. I'm not suggesting you do that, but you're going to see it has no insulation in it. All these types of things. Your job is to not pre-inspect the house yourself. Your job is to get to see the house, write some notes down, and then maybe pass those off and have the house, to the inspector, and have the inspector be the bad guy. You do not want the seller to do anything other than love you. You're not going to give them advanced tips on staging the house, decorating the house. You're not going to tell them anything that might even give them the slightest reason not to like you.
Don't kill your own deal.
Yeah. I mean, inexperienced agents will walk in and they'll say, well, move the couch here, move the couch there, take down your rare plate collection from your walls, and, you got to paint that chartreuse wall white. Nobody likes chartreuse walls and all these things. Well, it turns out you just offended the hell out of that seller, and there's no way you're going to get that listing. So keep your yap shut. Be professional. You're there to properly price the property and get the listing contract signed, and let the other professionals do their job.
And we learned that early on because they would often say, you were the only agents who were enthusiastic about my house, even if their house was just kind of an average house.
Well, let's be honest. When we first got into real estate, we didn't know anything about real estate really anyway.
We couldn't kill the deal.
We couldn't kill the deal because we were so enthusiastic and we did like everything.
Nervous energy.
We didn't have enough experience to know what was good and bad, what buyers would like or dislike. Yeah. And we didn't even know they put dates on hot water tanks.
I know. Ignorance was bliss. So, Okay. So number 3, prepare 3 net sheets for your seller, low, medium, and high. Now, many MLSs have net sheets built into them now. You just have to plug and chug the numbers. Some of your title companies can set you up, and there are apps for doing seller's net sheets. Those should include not just your commission, not just selling costs, but things like, I used to put in an extra $1,000 for inspection items just to suggest that might come up. But you need 3 net sheets, low, medium, and high.
Well, I'm going to give them the marketing reason why you want to do this too. So you're going on a listing presentation. You're competing with, 2 or 3 other agents. We want you to send net sheets ahead of time. We want you to send the pre-listing pack along with your CMA. Now, we want you to give low, medium, and high pricing and low, medium, and high net sheets. Why? Because, Bob might show up and decide to overprice the listing just to try to get it. Let's say the house is worth $750. Old Bob rolls in knowing it's worth $750, but hell, he's going to tickle the seller's greed button. He's going to tell him it's worth $825, and they're going to list with him because Bob thought he could get $825. And all the while, Bob knows that all he's going to try to do is whittle the sellers down over time and get the price down. So in preparation for Bob not necessarily being as honest as he should be, not saying that ever happens. Nope. Never happens in real estate. But in the event that it does, make sure you've done what we suggest. Now, why do you want to put a low one in there? Well, because you might walk in there and it turns out they're running a mini farm in the house and they have a marijuana growery in the basement. We actually had a rental property where after the tenant moved out, this was out of state, and we had our manager go in and say the entire first floor is molded. Why? Because they had a full-time growery going in the basement. I mean, this was like at scale growing dope, and this was in a state where it was not legal.
Yes, grow lights plus wet basement equals mold.
And by the way, this was a nice neighborhood and a nice house.
Yeah.
I mean, that's crazy. But in any event, so yeah, give them low, medium, and high. And then most likely it's going to fall slightly above the medium or the average prices where you're going to probably price it, unless the house merits it. Now, you're going to have to get into the nuance, differences as to why a house would merit being priced above what a reasonable comp would be. And you can get into the weeds as far as like, is a pool worth more in your market or less in your market? Like I can tell you in certain parts of, Austin and whatnot, if you don't have a pool, it's a deal killer. That just is what it is. Now, if you have a pool in a lot of other parts of the country, it's a deal killer. People don't want pools. You guys get it? So if someone put in a $100,000 pool in a market where nobody wants a pool, that $100,000 pool is actually a liability to getting the property sold. And there are a lot of other examples. If you're in a 4-bedroom neighborhood and the seller's got a 3-bedroom with a loft, oh, look at this artsy fartsy loft we converted the 4th bedroom into. That's not good. As a rule, guys, in a house, do not remove bedrooms or bathrooms.
People don't usually like that.
So you got to know all these things, right?
Yes. Okay. Now, point number 4, if the subject property is too far out of your wheelhouse, or if you can't find comparable sales, ask for help from an appraiser, your coach, and your broker. Make an effort to circle the wagons. They might not have great comps either, but they may have some other strategies, especially from the appraisal standpoint.
Well, I'm going to throw another one in there, Jules.
Yes.
If it's a really high-end listing, I'll tell you what I would do is co-list it.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, Jade Mills, who we talk about now and then, who's one of the top listing brokers in the nation of luxury real estate. She's out in LA. One of her go-tos is co-list with the other, big name. There's a Valerie Fitzgerald out there, and there's a couple others. The seller's always going to make Jade compete, even if center of influence past client, because chances are high-end seller's going to know all the high-end agents because they go to all the high-end parties and high-end clubs and whatnot, right? So they all know each other. Like we said, center of influence past client marketing by itself does have a limit to how much business you're going to get from it. So what Jade's smart enough to do is if she gets the sense that the seller's actually making her compete and it's against one of these top agents, she'll actually throw out there, let's do a co-list. And the seller gets his cake and eats it too, and they love it.
Yeah, and that works if it's just something that's different for you. Maybe it's a mixed use property. Maybe you've never listed a farm before. Don't just not go on the appointment or throw it back to the lead pond. Get some help, and co-listing is a great way to get some experience. Okay, number 5, once you've settled in on a price, check it against active competition and ensure it makes sense in the lineup. That's especially important if it's a couple weeks between your appointment and launching the listing. For example, if your subject property is, like you said, Tim, a 3-bedroom, don't price it like it's a 4-bedroom, even if it does have a loft. If you're the only home without a garage in the neighborhood, you have to adjust for that. If the property backs up to a freeway, a power tower, or a parking lot, you have to adjust. If it's the only thing available in the popular neighborhood, you can adjust up. Finally, realize that pricing is an ongoing conversation that's affected daily by many factors: interest rates, competing inventory, new homes for sale nearby, and local economic factors like companies laying people off, or conversely bringing in hundreds or thousands of new employees. Every comparable market analysis, every CMA you do adds to your pricing skills. So don't wing it. Print this guide. Tim told you how to get the notes. Follow it every time you are pricing a home to list, and as well as preparing a buyer to write an offer.
And we didn't even talk about mineral rights. We didn't even talk about air rights. We didn't even talk about water rights. We didn't even talk about one side of the street is more desirable than the other because the other side of the street has a massive, oil pipeline that's, though buried in the backyard, it is back there and you could drive a semi truck through it. You guys get it?
Well, even like condos, I know, like, for example, in Long Beach and other beach towns in California, from building to building, if one building has no VRBO for you and the building next to it has lenient VRBO rules, well, guess who's going to sell for more? Probably.
Well, that's right. But also in those buildings, again, there's a lot to this, guys. In those buildings, if there are too many rentals, that means it's going to, probably financing isn't going to happen because a lot of times FHA will remove them from an approved condo list because there's too many rentals and short-term rentals count as rentals.
Well, that's right. So maybe this building has to be virtually all and only cash offers to defeat that problem. Does that make it worth more or less? Sometimes it's going to be less, right? Sometimes there's a building that has, I know I've had a lot of East Coast clients in these really old towns with popular neighborhoods, but there's literally no parking. There's not even a parking spot. You just have to figure that out. So that can affect your pricing.
We have coaching clients in Manhattan, in the financial district and other places where the building will have, I call it it's a brownstone if it's in certain parts, whatever, but it has a garage or it has a 2-car garage. Well, guess what? If they don't even have a car, which a lot of people in Manhattan don't drive, they just, Uber or whatever, they can rent that garage out for a flippin' fortune. And that actually becomes a substantial value add to that property and makes it worth a lot more. But if you didn't know it had a garage, let alone that garage could be worth as much as $20,000 a month in rent, you heard me right, well, you lose. You guys get it?
You have to do a CMA on the garage.
You do, honestly. You have to treat it almost like a separate asset to the property. So know your market, guys. Hopefully we've exposed you to the fact that there's so much more you can learn to become a true expert at real estate. That, there's the idea that buyer agency is going to come to an end is not true. The idea that there's buyer's agents that are going to come to an end in their careers is true. So the ones that are going to survive are the ones that have the skill set. This information we gave you guys today is applicable whether you're focusing on buyers or sellers. This does give you an advantage in the marketplace. Just listening to us today, you definitely are more educated. I'm guessing that you're definitely feeling more motivated because you realize how much more you can learn and how much more that will make you feel unique in the marketplace. Now it's up to you to take action. The action that you should be taking is definitely to join Premier Coaching. The link is down below in the show description, or just go to premiercoaching.com. Have a fantastic day. We'll talk with you on the show tomorrow.